Keti Chukhrov and Sami Khatib. Both were in Ljubljana before, and they are well known here. Some of their work was translated into Slovene even. So I will just briefly introduce them by one sentence. Keti Chukhrov is a visiting professor at European University in St. Petersburg, and currently she has a fellowship of Marie Curie in UK. And Sami Khatib works now, he was previously in American University at Beirut, and now he's at some Falani University at Hamburg somewhere. And he's in shape because he's already drinking beer, so let's get to the point. So, Keti.
Now, you have to
turn it on.
Okay, thanks. Do you hear me? I'm really glad to be here in Ljubljana again with my beloved colleagues, and it's always a great pleasure to be here for a venue. So thanks, Mirt and Aufhebung. And I just wanted to mention my main university, otherwise they might be angry with me, the Higher School of Economics. Otherwise they detain my payment. I will be talking about the end, about the infinity of end, in which art had collapsed since modernity. I will start from a funny story about my friend, a well-known Russian actionist artist, Anatoly Smolovsky. When being in residency in the Russian north, he was sailing by boat with other artists along the river bank, when one of his friends suggested to get out at the meadow to have a picnic. But Smolovsky fiercely objected to it, shouting that they could not stop there because it was not a proper meadow. To a question of his friend why it was not proper, he answered, because this meadow is not fashionable. So they sailed further and stopped at the meadow slightly away from the previous place, and although the new meadow was completely identical with the previous one, Smolovsky agreed that the new meadow was fashionable enough to get out and have picnic there. This story excellently manifests the conceptualist logic of a ready-made. So what we have here nominally similar and identical objects which are conceptually different. One meadow is simply a piece of nature. Another is not nature anymore, but has a cognitive, sapient impact, which nevertheless cannot be sensuously traced or confirmed, nor can it be cognitively comprehended in a conventional way. We deal here with an excessive tautology, a surplus abstraction, which is hovering above the materiality, because the fashionableness of a second meadow cannot be confirmed. Quite a Joseph Kossuth-ian act. What forms such a paradoxical abstraction? On the one hand, we encounter here a classical case of what I, once in my text, defined as a simple machine of conceptualism. We have two elements, two meadows, that construct a machine of reciprocal indexal relation, a nonsensical reference between two meadows becoming a cognitive trick, a nonsense proposition. In her book, The Originality of the Avant-Garde and Other Modernist Myths, Rosalind Krauss, in her attempt to discover a specific semiotic paradigm of conceptual act, refers to Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic category of index. The index represents something that is not mimetic. It is a dynamic correlation of two elements, of two signs, of a sign and an object, as with a pointing finger or a trace of a bullet in the window. The index does not symbolize or resemble. The prevalence of index semiology makes conceptual work a simple machine that always preserves the gap between the two correlated elements. What is important in the indexality of a conceptual work is this disjunctive gap. despite the act of correlation. That is, in a conceptual work, the third explicatory semantic element, the symbol that otherwise would symbolize or lubricate these two, is absent. This means that in conceptualism, idea is turned into a speculative paradox in its tautological literalness. Such semantic disjunctive gap causing the failure of interpretation is a hiatus that a Russian philosopher Valery Podoroga calls in contemporary artworks kairos, some happy, explosive moment of dialectics between comprehension and miscomprehension. And Frederick Jameson defines the same phenomenon as a gimmick. This leads to the collapse of sensuous perception of an artwork in favor of that very negative instant of suspended perception, which acquires a conceptual relevance. Now, the specimen about the example about the fashionable meadow that I brought forth is a classical case of negativist, conceptualist, and avant-garde gesture, and its technique of paradoxical indexality is quite evident in examples, which I quickly list for you. Well, first of all, the classics of conceptualism, which is Baldessari's pointing. This is exactly indexality in its realization. The two elements which are disjunctive but will never get into proposition. This is quite reminiscent of the example that I brought about meadow. This is the photography of the floor above the floor by Victor Bergin, which is the classical case of the tautology of two objects which are correlated and in a nonsensical disjunction exactly in this example. So you see, again, Gordon Martha Clark's the wholeness of a house and the rupture in it, again, two elements which are always apart. Here, the mundane object, which is a saucepan and Stalin's ideological icon within it. Boys, the fat and chairs, so the vitality and furniture, culture and vitality. And Marcel Duchamp's classical case. So this is very, very, very trivial and understandable. I just brought these examples to make things more more obvious. Meanwhile, if we return to our initial anecdote about the fashionable meadow along with the transcognitive trick, so along with this conceptual machine, there is one more element that inscribes the certain intangible surplus into this trick. This supplementary component is added to the indexal junction between the two meadows. And on the one hand, we have this conceptual play between these two complements, two elements, but there is some kind of addition that is asserting and instituting one of the meadows as fashionable. This assertion of a non-existent quality as of surplus exceeds simply conceptual paradox between two tautological objects. It surpasses the representation of the conceptual gimmick, conceptual trick, to become the act of instituting, the act of bureaucracy, the act of a powerful act of bureaucratic institution. We witness such an act of instituting the nonsensical as early as in Malevich's Black Square, Duchamp's Pissoir, Koshut's chair, or Warhol's Campbell soup. Thus, the first component, a simple machine of indexality, is a specific regime of conceptualization of objecthood, of reification of cognitive paradox. This act is post-aesthetic, but it still preserves the regime of 0 degree of aesthetics in Adornian sense. But then the second act of institution, of this adding of institutional surplus, is authoritarian. Both of these components mark a Copernican turnover, not merely of de-aesthetization of art, but also an act of its voluntary self-sublation. And self-sublation, interestingly and curiously, only confirms and institutes the empty turn of no art, as art's artness. However, we think that this is a new condition of curatorial practices. My inference and conjecture is that this feature was there already in Adorno, who actually was never interested in the issue of aesthetic medium, as many assume when referring to modernism. For Adorno, the stake of negative counter-aesthetics was in the ultimate nullification of artistic sensuousness, in inevitable reaching art's 0 degree, not because this condition was wanted, but because it was inevitable in capitalist economy and sociality. So, what remains from the impossibility of art and its sensuousness in an alienated social existence is only the apophatic hush, articulation of the ineffable, incarnation of emptiness, and the absence of the spirit and truth that is superseded by formalization of this emptiness. In this sense, Adorno's aesthetics is anti-aesthetics, contrary to the allegation, for example, that of Jameson, that modernism retains aesthetics and remains to be art, whereas contemporary art does not, postmodernity does not. I would not agree with that inference. Of course, Adorno is quite far from this tautologist that I demonstrated. Still, his insistence on the impossibility of sensuous parameters and artwork's total alterity to culture and society is very important and paramount for the syndrome of art's self-awareness about its end and absence. So this is very important, that art spits on itself, that it ends, nullifies itself. Thus, already with Adorno, the abstracted method of production becomes not merely an art piece or an aesthetic tendency, but a gnoseological institute of art's nullification. And this leads to a specific phenomenology of art's exposure in its history, when materiality or substance, such as, for instance, Boyce's fat or Matthew Barney's Vaseline, or even the performance bodies, are being exposed before us, before the audience, for hours, days, but this does not imply any sensuous experience or any contemplation of their unmediated presence. What matters here is that concept is prevailing over materiality. Let's remember Hegel's extremity of spirit, which is hovering over materiality, so that matter and objecthood become a reified speculative work. As we see here objects, but they don't matter in chairness of the chair or fatness of the fat, but what matters is this correlation, speculative correlation. But even more important, as I said, is this bureaucratic instituting that so that a separate singular art gesture should stand for art universally. And the greatest artworks achieve such scale of superseding the whole hyper-institute in one work. So this is such a work, for instance, Black Square or Campbell's Soup, which is not an artwork, but it's the artness of art in its reified totality. It's the whole institute. And this is a fantastic feature of art in the condition of its radical end, when a set of institutions and their agencies can be one piece of an artwork, and one piece of an artwork can be all art, can be all institute, all globality, all contemporaneity. Such degree of totalization and self-sublation never took place in dance, music, cinema, or theater, which might derange or deconstruct themselves, but they still crave for the audience to watch how they are being deranged. That's why they are not art. Meanwhile, art dared to commit this ultimate spit into the face of an audience, and only after that it reconstituted the institute in meta terms and globalized it. Which means that contemporary art has to institute something that is absent, as if it were present. It has to institute fashionability of this meadow when ontologically this does not exist. It has to assert the absence of the meadow's fashionable condition, as if it were its existent status. Meanwhile, what is physically present, that very natural meadow, is absent and subsumed by conceptual surplus. Yet today, if we look what is happening in the context of all these ideas about new materialisms, object-oriented ontologies, etc., we see that there's a strong exhaustion with that very conceptual paradoxality, with this negativity characteristic for classical avant-garde strategies. And we see descendants of the rigidity of conceptual lexicons to mere hyperrealist presences accompanied by theoretic design and explication. Art is tired of its apophasa, of its apophatic rigidity and conceptual codex. In the recent 10-15 years, we have been seeing a complete decomposition of conceptual paradox, of the Dadaist controversy, and of the splendor of semantic disjunction of simple machines that I demonstrated. Art's negativity gets more and more permeated with emergent desire for pleasure and enjoyment, for pop culture immersiveness and empathy, ritualistic self-affectation, for erotization, dramatic and performing abundance, for psychedelic trips and gaming interactivity, for quasi-scientific research or social studies. In short, art craves for affirmative experiences. It is craving for presences instead of constantly castrating itself to remain inexistent and absent. That's why many define it as post-conceptual and meta-modernist. This is the condition touched upon Frederick Jameson in his essay from New Left Review, The Aesthetics of Singularity. I quickly quote. I understand modernist conceptual art as the production of physical objects which flex mental categories by pitting them against each other. And conceptual objects are therefore a little like antinomies or paradoxes or koans in the verbal philosophical realm, occasions for meditative practice. Meanwhile, postmodern, neo, or post-conceptualism is not at all like that. It is soaked in theory. These works are as theoretical as they are visual, but they do not illustrate an idea, nor do they put a contradiction through its paces, nor do they force the mind to follow the eyes inexorably through a paradox or an antinomy in the gymnastics of some conceptual exercise. Concept is there, but it is singular, non-universal, and rather nominalistic than universal. It is a mixture of theory and singularity. So these works are full of this paradoxical antinomy, whereas what Jameson is talking about is more like Damien Hirst's shark and this radical uncanny presences that contemporary art so much abounds with. And truly the conceptualist paradox, although it was a quasi-philosophic gnoseological study, so these types of classical works, a sort of ironic critique of enlightenment, they were nonetheless confined to straightforward theoretic narrative. But they were malicious, playful, on the verge of sanity and insanity. A conceptual artist has always been a wacky, even when bureaucratizing and instituting one's empty contents, so that what is defined today as post-conceptual condition of contemporary culture has nothing to do with that very paradoxic quasi-philosophy of Cogitian type that I accounted for. And interestingly, this new condition, new post-conceptual condition of nominalistic presences that I mentioned resonates with definitely theoretical writing on art, developed around new materialisms and object-oriented ontologies. There's a lot of that in writing on aesthetics by Graham Harman and his younger followers. But what is their idea both for theory and the presence of an artwork? They think that aesthetics is about unmediated presence. They think that sensuousness is about this, straightforward exposure of affectation. And that's why they crave and they call for liberating art for any verbal, linguistic, contextual packaging and conceptual codes, and search for the pure realness of matter and of objecthood. Again, this excessive nominalism that I mentioned. However, with all that said, we have to acknowledge a strange fact in this connection, and this fact is usually unheeded by thinkers who comment affirmatively or negatively on the emergence of this post-conceptual nominalism. The trick and the strange fact subsists in the following. Despite art is tired of its syndrome of negativity and self-sublation, despite it wants to terminate its end and apophatic severeness by means of various techno-scientific or positivist affirmations, it does not succeed in such termination. And the codex of art as a hyper-institute of conceptualization sustains. So why does it sustain? Because a certain force uplifts any work as soon as it gets on the territory of contemporary art to establish it as fashionable meadow, instead of simply contemplating meadow's meadowness. The force that effectuates this uplifting and adds the surplus of artness to pieces that are otherwise incompatible with art's canon resides, as I said, in this bureaucratic power act instituting and converting into art. As I claimed already before, in the classical cases, the bureaucracy was not any external imposition on a piece. This bureaucracy of instituting for Malevich, for Kossuth, it wasn't an institutional repression of a system in order to squeeze the art practice into context, but it was arising as the only condition of production of art as of quasi-theoretical, non-sensuous, paradoxic procedure. Hence, the biggest authoritarian bureaucrat was an artist himself. Therefore, I would say that even in modernist methodologies as theorized by Adorno, they already infer this making an artistic proposition in the regime of bureaucratic institution of various modes of aesthetic nullification. And I think that canon of new music that Adorno writes about is such an institute. It cannot sustain without bureaucracy. Nevertheless, even when we do not have this surplus element or conceptual rigidity, the institute sustains by means of the following act. It itself automatically provides this surplus by emptifying any aesthetic gesture or any contents in order to thus integrate whatever practice into the institute, thus capitalizing nothing in the status of a fashionable something. Thus, the Institute of Art functions like King Midas. Whatever King Midas is touching, everything becomes gold. So the hyperrealist presences of simulacra that Jameson decries as bad modernity and postmodernity, they are automatically by a magic act transfused by the Art Institute into quasi-conceptualist condition. And I give you again an example which was very popular this year at the Viennese Biennial, a work that got an award, Anna Imhoff's Faust. So if you have seen this performance or whatever, it is comprising fashion, dance, music, architecture, theater, beauty, psychedelic mysteria, immersion, ritual, dramatization, everything. All that stylistics and some kind of richness, eroticism that was impossible on the territory of contemporary art. Yet we see that Art Institute immediately tunes it into certain blankness to deprive it of any substantiality and make it into an object, into a blank exhibit. So if one dances on stage, it will not be art, it will be dance. But nominally, completely the same dance can be packaged as art if the aesthetic medium and contents of it are ignored and nullified, if it is claimed to be a bad dance, and then this emptiness and badness of dance will be endowed by surplus degree of fashionability in a specific assertion of a non-art as art. The same goes, in fact, for any socially engaged projects, because, well, when we come from art, we are very much used to understand how productive, how incredibly important and engaged art is in social practice, et cetera, et cetera. But if we look what happens in socially engaged practices, they derange themselves, but not as was the avant-garde dissolution in life, but rather they produce these political contents as the design, as the form. So when the Institute subsumes them, it again amplifies these socially engaged contents as the design and sucks this piece already in its blankness, so that the only act of which is to label the amplified form then as fashionable meadow. And then the main statement of artwork is like, I am contemporary art. 5 minutes left, and I fit. Now, with all that said, it becomes clear why in communist aesthetics of historical socialism, there was such a mistrust of modernism and such an obsession with Hegel's paradigm of art's sensuousness as it evolves in classical art. As Mikhail Lifshitz reminds in his introduction to Hegel's aesthetics, for Hegel, art is realization of idea, but not of philosophy or theory. That is, for revealing the truth in art, the conceptual, spiritual should meet the sensuous. Well, this is trivial, this is quite clear. But by this procedure of pleroma and mesotes, the conflation of matter and spirit, which Hegel remarks only in the classical art, is possible to exert a fantastic thing. So this conflation of the spiritual and the sensuous brings to something incredible. It brings to the possibility to incarnate the ideal, to make ideal material, when it at the same time is ideal but remains objective and real. And this is what the classicality and the classical art, which Hegel mentions as a specific experience, is exerting. And in such fantastic condition, it becomes possible to operate with the infinite, with the ideal within the finite, as if the ideal and the infinite were the finite. That's why it was important for communism. And that's why, consequently, the crazy idea of communist aesthetics, that only the classical condition can truly be communist, is not maybe that insane. It simply abides to standpoint that in communism, not only political economy changes in terms of surpassing surplus value economy, surpassing abstraction of labor, abstraction of economy, surpassing alienation, but the ontics itself transform in that not only socially but ontically the material and the conceptual, the concrete and abstract converge. This was epitomizing the main obsession of all communist and socialist philosophy about how to prove that Hegel's ideal is already functioning in communist reality. And then a fantastic thing becomes possible, that if ontically material and spiritual, material and conceptual are the same, then ontics is superseded by ontology. Then idealness and non-idealness and the infinite, as I say, becomes mundane. And we live in paradise. Now I will put aside this controversial statement and return to the idea of sensuousness, and will end with it. And it is the observation of Mikhail Lifshitz again when he says that, what is this sensuousness for Hegel? Why is it so important? On the one hand, Hegel all the time says that this is something different to spirit. This is alienating the spirit. Then he says that this is some kind of opposition and dialectical rejection of the spirit in the sensuous. So what he claims is that, and what actually Hegel claims, is that sensuousness is the cycle of spirit. And it is descending of the sublime, descending of the upper and higher to the lower. And isn't it Orpheus making this? Isn't it Christ making this? Isn't it Dante doing this? So these descendants, this becoming the sensuous by the idea that seems to be in classical art, some kind of harmony, is a torture. It's a martyrdom. So I would say that the issue of negativity that seems to be melancholy and some sort of misery all the time, as against pacification of classical harmony, can be reinterpreted in a completely different way. It is harmony that is painful, and as Mladen mentioned, it is beauty that is unbearable. Lifshitz mentions this, I think Stefan Holscher today showed this, specimens of convergence of the ideal in the everyday of beggars. Lifshitz calls this enantiodromy, so descendants of the ideal and sublime to the lowest, and the capacity of the lowest by this token of modesty of the ideal to descend to the lowest and to incarnate itself, to uplift itself and ascend to the ideal. And that's how they converge. And the capacity of the lowest and the most humiliated to assert itself as the ideal, as the highest. This is what Christ did. Thank you.
So, is it working? No. Yes. Good evening, everybody. No, it's not working. It was. We will calibrate the distance. Yesterday, Rebecca had the second micro. That was very good. Remember? Is this one? Okay. Let's. Exactly. That's the feedback. No, it's not on? No. No, anyways, we will work on that. So, now we try it, and when there is it's good, or? No. Nobody moves now, please. Okay. Yes, thanks, Peter. I also should add, for the sake of my current employer, I'm working at the moment drinking beer in the evening, sure. But no, and I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher at Leuphana University in Lüneburg, which is actually close by Hamburg, but it's a city of its own. And thanks Aufhebung, thanks Mirt, Bada, and Martin and all others for inviting me again. I think it's the third time already with Aufhebung, and I'm very happy to be back. And as a kind of an improvised transition from Keti's paper to my paper, I would refer maybe again to Anne Imhoff's performance artwork at Venice Biennale. I read in one, I can't remember it really correctly, and I don't even agree, but I read a review of that show that it is basically an almost Adornian reflection, not a mimicry, but a reflection of the commodity form and the dystopian universe of contemporary capitalism, but still with an aesthetic quality. So don't shoot the messenger, because that was actually a response to another rather polemic review that I read by Benjamin Buchloh, who said basically it's a cheap version of Berlin-Berghain transferred to for some art audience in a very cynical manner. That don't shoot the messenger, the Anne Imhoff, but just see it as an immanent reflection of current tendencies of the commodity form. I don't comment on that, maybe. I hear already this bad echo here. So this paper is called Aesthetics as Sensuous, Supra-Sensuous Science, Hegel-Marx-Benjamin. I was very glad actually that in certain versions of the title, the subtitle was dropped, thanks to Mirt actually. Now it, no, it fit better than actually, after thinking about it again, I thought you were right. Nevertheless, in the final program it reappeared. So I had to do something about that, try it. Aesthetics as sensuous, supra-sensuous science already is an indicator that probably aesthetics is not dealt with here in the manner of Baumgarten as sensuous perception, also not of Early Benjamin as non-sensuous perception. Aesthetics is not a theory of aesthetic judgment, but rather aesthetics as sensuous, supra-sensuous science gets quite close to what Hegel describes as aesthetics in the lectures on fine art, Aesthetics 1, and that's basically the connection. That is also why I quite optimistically proposed that title, that subtitle, Hegel-Marx-Benjamin. But of course, as a disclaimer, I have to admit that the triad of Hegel, Marx, and Benjamin doesn't really work, and there are reasons why this is so. While the sequence of Hegel, Marx, and Marx, Benjamin seem unproblematic and more or less explored by the respective scholarship, the coupling of Hegel and Benjamin, whatever its middle term, immediately raises objections. I raise objections against that echo. Really, I hear an echo. You as well? I haven't moved at all in the meantime.
But if you like, do you want more light?
No, light has nothing to do with it. It's it's the other channel. But thank you. Sure.
Do you feel comfortable to have it in hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but Peter, when I have it in my hand, I will always move around. I know myself. Then always different echo. Is better? Okay.
No light on here.
And I actually, now I spoke already so much. You remind me 25 minutes. Also, I didn't say, of course, I cannibalized another paper for it, which is published, and tried to do a montage with Hegel. So, of course, it doesn't work in the end. So you have to stop me after 25 minutes, and then I will see where we are. Again, we had the problem with Hegel-Marx-Benjamin, but the coupling of Marx and Hegel is fine. Benjamin and Marx also is fine, but Hegel and Benjamin definitely a big no. Why is this so? So Benjamin, as the cliché has it, was an outspoken anti-Hegelian thinker. His thought image of a dialectics at a standstill couldn't be further away from Hegel's restless movement of dialectical unfolding, not to mention Hegel's philosophy of history, against which Benjamin proposed a messianic concept of history for all those oppressed people of the past and present who lost their world historical court case against Hegel's Weltgeschichte as Weltgericht, world history as world juridical sentence. Contrary to the assumed irreconcilability of Hegel and Benjamin, the coupling of Hegel and Marx is classic, well-researched, and has a long history, culminating in the post-Frankfurt School readings of the so-called Neue Marx-Lektüre, and its basic insight was that Hegel's logic is the key to Marx's Capital, and the Begriffslogik can be read in analogy to Marx's value form analysis in the beginning sections of Capital Volume 1. The third possible coupling, Benjamin and Marx, is also well researched. Adorno and Benjamin's letter correspondence of the 1930s tell the story of Benjamin's, however problematic yet productive misreading of Marx's theory of commodity fetishism through the lenses of his own aesthetico-political theory of phantasmagoria and collective dream images of the world of commodities. While Benjamin's reading of Capital 1 remained fragmentary, and of course those readers of Arcade's project know that is convolute X. Actually, Benjamin compiled a list of all the most interesting, most intriguing passages of Capital Volume 1, but we don't get so much of a commentary here. But anyways, there is something, but it is fragmentary. His take on the early political writings of Marx are well documented and have given rise to a sequence of Marxian Benjamin scholarship focusing on class struggle, history, and the concept of revolution. Probably the most productive connection here is Marx's 18th Brumaire and Benjamin's famous thesis 14 on Yetz's side in the thesis on the concept of history, but I'm not going to do this today. In the following paper, I won't revisit either terrain, but propose to displace the uneven triad of Hegel, Marx, and Benjamin to the realm of aesthetics, or more precisely, to a parallel reading of the dual characters of the work of art and the commodity. In the end, I hope to be able to suggest a different understanding of aesthetics, neither bound to a philosophy of fine art, aesthetic judgment, nor theory of perception. My point of departure is Hegel's understanding of the work of art and Marx's theory of commodity fetishism. In the concluding part, I will expand this reading to Benjamin's dialectical reading of symbol and allegory, alluding to what I called elsewhere the aesthetics of real abstraction. First part. According to Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, the work of art presents both the cut and mode of reconciliation between the sensuous and supra-sensuous world. In this way, spirit, and there's a quote, generates out of itself works of fine art as the first reconciling middle term between pure thought and what is merely external, sensuous, sinnlich, and transient, between nature and finite reality and the infinite freedom of conceptual thinking. End of quote. A surprising echo of this passage can be found in Marx's discovery of the commodity form and its peculiar sensuous, supra-sensuous materiality, sinnlich, übersinnlich. The commodity has a dual character, being both sensuous use value and supra-sensuous exchange value. The commodity is thus not an ordinary thing, but a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing, sinnlich, übersinnliches Ding, endowed with social characteristics. Reading Marx's Capital with Hegel's Aesthetics, the commodity and the artwork share the intertwinement of sensuousness and supra-sensuousness as middle terms. And likewise, capital as spirit is embodied in commodities. However, commodities never succeed in reconciling their value being, Wertsein, with their sensuous graphicness. Of course, I won't have time here to get into details of what we may make of Hegel's term reconciliation, Versöhnung in this context, since also in reconciliation, the restlessness of dialectics is still operative. For the moment, I suggest to reconsider Marx's famous opening lines from the chapter on commodity fetishism from Capital, Volume 1. Of course, we all know that, but I repeat it. A commodity appears, at first sight, an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is a use value, there is nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it satisfies human needs, or that it first takes on these properties as the product of human labor. It is absolutely clear that by his activity man changes the forms of the materials of nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of it. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary, sensuous thing. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing, sinnlich, übersinnliches Ding. And allow me that short remark. Also, the 1990 Ben Fogg's translation of Capital Volume 1 doesn't get that right. It still translates it as a thing that transcends sensuousness, operating with a binary universe of either sensuous or suprasensuous. But we are precisely here introduced to a world of sensuous, suprasensuous thing, which is a third term. So a first Hegelian lesson that can be drawn from this passage relates to Marx's use of the word Schein, or scheinen, appearance, appearing. Eine Ware scheint auf den ersten Blick ein selbstverständliches, triviales Ding. A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing. This first sight already catches the essential feature of the commodity. What appears is essential to the commodity's essence. Defending art against the verdict of being bloßer Schein, pure appearance, leading to deception, Hegel wrote, "Appearance itself is essential to essence." Likewise, in the case of the commodity, what appears a sensuous thing is essential to essence, since the appearing feature, the graphic sensuous shine, appearance of commodities, is the only mode the essence of a commodity can have in the world, as being a thing. As we know from Marx, the sensuous commodity is the only material sensuous bearer, the vessel of some essence, which in turn is nothing stable, but only the expression of a purely social relation that goes by the name of value. Being value, Wertsein, cannot appear other than in the pure appearance, shine of sensuous things. In other words, commodities as sensuous objects are a necessary form of appearance of non-sensuous social relations. Value, which structure social relations in capitalism. In contrast to a traditional Marxist understanding of false consciousness, it is not that ideologically produced illusions veil material relations, but rather that sensuous things produced by capitalist society, commodities in their very graphicness, veil social relations. That is why Marx's definition of the commodity as a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing has to be taken most literally. Unlike in religions of spiritual beliefs, in capitalism, the sensuous world veils a non-sensuous reality, the dimension of value. Here we find the materialist kernel of Marx's otherwise merely rhetorical formulation, according to which commodities are abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Capitalism's physis produces its own naturally grown metaphysics. This strange feature, remotely reminiscent of Hegel's introduction of the work of art in his lectures on aesthetics, led Marx in the original 1867 edition of Das Kapital to the introduction of an equally instructive and obscuring image. Explaining the commodity's social essence of being value, while at the same time arguing that this essence cannot other than appear as a sensuous appearance, Marx wrote, another famous quote, "It is as if alongside and external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form, when grouped together, the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc., of the animal kingdom, there existed also, in addition, the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom." As it's well known, Marx later dropped that passage. It explains a lot, also obscures a lot, depending on how you read Capital Volume 1. So Marx's project, as I claim here, of the critique of political economy, could be summed up as the science of this animal and its spectral mode of existence. In societies, quote, in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, this is the first sentence of Capital Volume 1, it is as if the abstract dimension of value acquires a life of its own. The dual character of the commodity, pertaining to both use value and exchange value, creates a seemingly autonomous sphere of value relations, which have cut themselves loose from the sensual world of concrete commodities and the dimension of their use value. Still okay, or yeah? This autonomy, however, is not merely intellectual or ideal, as in the sphere of religion, where, quote, the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own. Rather, it is as if the mode of abstraction, namely value, has a real material existence of its own, independent of the human mind. As one real existing animal encounters another existing animal within the animal kingdom, in capitalism it is as if concrete sensuous objects encounter their mode of abstraction in real life. Following the logic of this image, the incarnation of such abstraction is in fact real. It is not the result of a subjective intellectual operation, but rather the effect of an objective and actually existing relation, social relation. And of course, I borrow this argument, it's a famous argument made by Alfred von Rethel on real abstraction. With the paradoxical nature of real abstraction, the limits of intellectual Darstellung, presentation, are reached. What then is the nature of the as-if existence of the animal as such? Is Marx deploying it as a mere metaphor, personification, animalization, symbol, or allegory? Can we simply distinguish between the meaning of of this image on the level of the signified and its mode of signification on the plane of the signifier? Or rather, is it not the cause that the linguistic structure of this image expresses the very paradox of the capitalist mode of valorization and signification? In fact, already on the categorical level of the commodity form, we encounter the limits of a mode of presentation that separates itself from the content it presents. If we follow this reading of Marx, the question arises whether and to what extent the value form of the commodity is structured in a metonymical or a metaphorical way. These various forms by which value and meaning are produced are precisely what I call here aesthetics, a science of real abstract things and relations, a science of sensuous supra-sensuousness. To what extent can we grasp the structure of the value form of the commodity in accordance with certain aesthetic forms of signification, like symbol and allegory? And what could Hegel and Benjamin tell us about these aesthetic forms? As we shall see, language and money have more in common than a positivist or empiricist reading of political economy would wish have it. Against a descriptive take on political economy and the attempts to separate the object of inquiry from its mode of presentation, the Copernican turn of the Marxian text is already articulated in the first sentence of Capital, Volume 1. Again, I quote, "The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Beginning with the form of appearance, the problem of presentation and the intertwinement of method and its object is introduced. Language is not external to this problem, but its very side." My first cue to tackle this intertwinement is hidden in Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, namely the problem of the dialectical fusion of sensuousness and supra-sensuousness in the realm of aesthetic forms. The locus classicus of this problem is the modern discourse on symbol and symbolization. In the section on the symbolic form of art, Hegel distinguishes between, first, unconscious symbolism, second, symbolism of the sublime, and third, conscious symbolism of the comparative art form. In the case of Marx's commodity fetishism, our guess is, of course, that the peculiar fusion of sensuousness and supra-sensuousness is listed under the first chapter on unconscious symbolism. However, as we shall see, the problem of commodity fetishism touches upon all three chapters and exceeds their scope to another dimension. I return to this at the end. Actually, I don't think so, it's already, but you tell me. For the moment, let's consider what Hegel writes about the symbol in general. Quote, "Symbol as such is an external, existent, given, or immediately present to contemplation, which yet is to be understood not simply as it confronts us immediately on its own account, but in a wider and more universal sense. Thus, at once, there are two distinctions to make in the symbol. First, the meaning, and second, the expression thereof. The first is an idea or a topic, no matter what its content. The second is a sensuous, existent, or a picture, Bild, of some kind or other. We can immediately draw a parallel to Marx here. The commodity is a material bearer of value. The commodity as a material bearer of value can broadly be mapped on meaning, that is value, and the expression thereof, that is the sensuous commodity as use value or representation of such a use value. With the next distinction of, however, this schematic matching a little bit more complicated. Hegel mentions two types of symbols in general. That's again a quote from the same section. First, now the symbol is prima facie a sign, Zeichen. But in a mere sign, the connection which meaning and its expression have with one another is only a purely arbitrary linkage. It's a beautiful translation, arbitrary, but actually it says willkürlich, but it's close. In that case, this expression, this sensuous thing or picture, so far from presenting itself, brings before our minds a content foreign to it, one with which it does not need to stand in any proper affinity whatever. So in languages, for example, the sounds are a sign of some idea, feeling, etc. Again, it's not Saussure, that is Hegel aesthetics. And the second case is, therefore, it is a different thing when a sign is to be a symbol. The lion, for example, is taken as a symbol for magnanimity, the fox of cunning, the circle of eternity, the triangle of the Trinity, and so on. But the lion and the fox do possess in themselves the very qualities whose significance they are supposed to express. So what type matches the commodity as symbol? The short answer, of course, is both. These two types of symbol allude to the two modes of existence of capital as both commodity and money. Symbol type 1, symbol as sign, arrives at its meaning in an arbitrary way, linking a sensuous expression, a coin, note, or number, to a non-sensuous meaning, that is, value. Hegel's reference to language and the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign, the unity of the sound, image, and the signified, alludes to a theory of the autonomy of the signifier, which in turn points to a homology in the case of the commodity as the sensuous expression of the autonomy of value. And I will return to this aspect in the discussion. There's no time here, of course, and I'm borrowing this, reading from, Samu is not here yet, right? I can do this. So I'm borrowing this from Samu Tomschit's excellent account in his title, The Capitalist Unconscious, the homology of the autonomy of the signifier in value, economy, and in the linguistic value. The most graphic expression of this autonomy is to be found in Marx's theory of money, even though Marx clearly rejects the theory that money is a mere sign, since he also maintains the argument of the second type. However, I should add here that I already decided before that I will skip that passage. It's an interesting twist here. Marx rejects the theory that money is a mere sign, ein reines bloßes Zeichen. Again, the English translation has it that he rejects the theory of money as being a mere symbol. So they conflate in the entire section sign and symbol, which is kind of ironic if we think of Hegel's distinction between the two types of the symbol, but anyways. Marx rejects that money is a mere sign, but on the other hand, he maintains a different theory of the sign, which is the longer part of the argument that I will maybe squeeze into the discussion. But I go now to symbol type 2. And symbol type 2, remember the fox, the lion for magnanimity or cunning, in contrast, is more in tune with a substantialist reading of Marx's labor theory of value. The amount of abstract labor time materialized in a commodity has an inherent link with the physical properties of that commodity. The meaning of a commodity, its economic meaning, so to speak, is expressed by sensuous commodities that match the degree of its labor intensity when being produced. However, we cannot miss the point that Marx's labor theory of value does not fully match Hegel's description of the second type of symbol. The sensuous, supra-sensuous value dimension of commodities relates to all other sensuous commodities as the animal relates to all other really existing animals, like lions, foxes, elephants, and so on. It is only the feature of the animal, it is the only feature of the animal to lend those other animals their specific, distinct animal-like features as animals. The animal as expression only expresses itself. The feature of lending all other existing animals the quality of expressing something with which they are not themselves, being an animal, being the bearer of value. Yeah. Look, even here, I skip all and jump to last passage. I wrote it in it. So I leave you with my highly condensed speculations, and you can just have to trust me that there is actually an argument behind it. Of course, I stole actually most from Samu's book, but anyways, we can do this later. So a last concluding part where I make some conclusions of something you haven't heard, but you just have to trust me here. So again, we have in mind there are the two types of symbol that I stole from a very late passage in the first volume of Hegel's Aesthetics, and somehow strangely matched it on the two dimensions that you can find in Marx when looking at value. And these were the two forms of existence of capital. One was money, the other one was commodity. And even though I made a couple of remarks on it and took it back partly, you can say that the first part, money, represents the autonomy of the signifier, and the second one, the commodity as use value, could be seen from the perspective as symbol, as the lion, as the fox, where actually there is an inherent material link between the sensuous expression and that what it should express, the meaning. And meaning, of course, we hear economic meaning, which means value. So the dual nature of the commodity, matching both types of Hegel's general explication of the symbol, is also at stake in Jochen Hörisch's reading of Marx and Benjamin. Hörisch argues that the commodity form is structured symbolically. That is to say, as a symbol and not as a mere sign. Money intervenes in what is signified by it. The commerce, Verkehr, of commodities is symbolically structured insofar as the commodity can stand in both the position of the signified and the signifier of use value. And I quote here from Hörisch: "The commodity as a thing partakes in the sphere of meaning and value. It is by virtue of commodity abstraction, signifier, and at the same time as a thing signified by commodity abstraction, the signified." End of quote. Owing to its dual character, being use value and exchange value, the commodity can function as a symbol in its original meaning as symbolon, designating a process of casting, throwing things together. The two modes of existence of capital, commodity and money, can fuse distinct spheres, the planes of the signified and the signifier, essence and appearance, or more generally, form and content. As Walter Benjamin argued in his book on Baroque Trauerspiel, mourning play, the vulgar understanding of symbol leads to a falscher Schein, the false appearance of totality. Whereas fragmentary, scattered brittleness is the domain of allegory, the symbol is inextricably connected to illusionary beauty. The symbol, however, is not necessarily of illusionary nature. When it is limited to its original domain, that is theology, the theological symbol renders the paradoxical, quote Benjamin, unity of the sensuous and supra-sensuous object, die Einheit von sinnlichem und übersinnlichem Gegenstand. Therefore, the symbolic illusion of false totality as put forward by late Romanticist aesthetics, has to be distinguished from an authentically theological, yet irretrievably lost unity of the sensuous and supra-sensuous object. Reading Marx with Benjamin, we can now add, in modern capitalism, the aesthetic and theological meaning of the symbol intersect. The quasi-transcendental medium of commodity language, money, creates the illusion of a false totality, as if money were a neutral medium that truly unifies the manifold of things and social relations. This false totality, however, is not a simple illusion, but the formal substitution of an authentic and therefore impossible, inaccessible unity expressed by the theological symbol. It is precisely this unity of sensuousness and supra-sensuousness that lends the commodity form its theological semblance. Niceties, theological niceties, as Marx said. Whereas the theological symbol always presents a singularity, the meaning of which can only be signified by itself, commodity language is structured by an infinite chain of differential signification, which we can call, with Samo Tomčić's book, the autonomy of the signifier. Every commodity speaks itself and thereby signifies another commodity. Every commodity speaks a differential value attached to a different object. The speaking of differential values, by the way, is precisely its position in the differential chain of different commodity values, and this purely quantitative differentiality is, of course, called exchange value. In other words, within commodity language, there is not only a beautiful appearance at work, in which, as Benjamin writes in the Arcades project, signifier and signified flow into each other, but a short circuit of self-signification. The commodity as exchange value is capable of signifying its own mode of signification. This self-signification is arbitrary, contingent, and lacks a self-conscious subject. Speaking the false universal language of money, commodities as exchange value can signify any use value without external referent, and thereby determine the mode how the signified is tied to the signifier. This mode of self-signification exceeds the realm of symbolization. The commodity thus is, as Hörisch suggests, not only a symbol but a super-symbol, always already on the verge to a fetish. As a fetish, a commodity acts as a socially animated thing endowed with seemingly mystical powers of self-motion and self-signification. I know I should end here, a couple of lines. However, if one shifts the perspective from the standpoint of value to the empirical materiality, the thingishness of the commodity, sensuousness, the dialectics of the commodity form reveals its polar opposite. Whereas commodities as exchange values allude to symbolic signification in a natural way without any cracks or gaps, commodities as use values appear as the fragmentary and ultimately contingent bearer of value. In other words, things as commodities perform their use value dimension in a denaturalized, allegorical way, whatever their specific use value may be. In the mid and late 1930s, especially in the Arcades project and in the studies on Baudelaire, Benjamin assembled a series of fragmentary leitmotifs that, if they had been elaborated, could have formed the theoretical kernel of an allegorical interpretation of the Marxian commodity form. And I quote here from Convolute J on Baudelaire. That is to say, Benjamin, that is to say, it is only the allegorical way of seeing that is able to perceive the brokenness of things that otherwise used to function as use values. Things as ruins only come into view when use values, whatever their specific use, have become obsolete or dysfunctional. Ruinedness is a mode of being deprived of wholeness, a thing deprived of its proper use or meaning. Following this optics, capitalist use values appear as ruins, for their use, meaning, is derived from an arbitrary mode of signification. In this vein, Benjamin famously stated, actually that is not the quote, this was my introduction of the quote. With the destabilization of the market economy, we begin to recognize the monuments of the bourgeoisie as ruins, even before they have crumbled. And now comes, finally, the quote from Convolute J. Through the disorderly fund which his knowledge places as his disposal, the allegorist rummages here and there for a particular piece, holds it next to some other piece, and tests it to see if they fit together, that meaning with this image, or this image with that meaning. The result can never be known beforehand, for there is no natural mediation between the two. But this is just how the matters stand with commodity and price. The metaphysical subtleties in which the commodity delights, according to Marx, are above all the subtleties of price formation. How the price of goods in each case is arrived at can never quite be foreseen, neither in the course of their production nor later when they enter the market. It is exactly the same with the object in its allegorical existence. At no point it is written in the stars that the allegorist's profundity will lead it to one meaning rather than another. And though it once may have acquired such a meaning, this can always be withdrawn in favor of a different meaning. The modes of meaning of the commodity is its price. It has, as commodity, no other meaning. I know I should give you the summary probably of which, of course, then in the end of the paper, I pitched the allegorical way as the use value dimension of value against this super symbol or fetishistic way of seeing the commodity as the exchange value dimension against each other. And that's basically the end of the paper. Yeah, let's end here.
So, thank you, Keti. Thank you, Sami. I'm sure there are a lot of questions for them now. Oh, Alenka.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. I really enjoyed both papers. And I have actually a question first just for Sami. Okay, you picked this triad, Hegel-Marx-Benjamin, but there is this, at least for me, there is this very strong resonance of this term, sensual, supra-sensual, which is the key term which Deleuze interprets masochism in Sacher-Masoch. And actually, I think it's a quote from Sacher-Masoch himself. And I'm not even sure if it is first Marx or Sacher-Masoch who used the term. Use sensual, super-sensual lover. It appears in the text. And it is actually very interesting because, okay, you have fetishism, you have the whole this, and you have aesthetics as particularly strong dimension of masochism. So I was just wondering if you, I mean, if you just didn't go into this, or if there is any.
I will come to you afterwards. I need the reference. I also need exactly the year
I mean, I'm not sure.
It is after 67.
It is, if it is from Venison first, I just checked, it was published in 1870. So it would be, but if it could be from another text, I'm not sure, I don't know.
No, it is actually a good point.
But it is very much at that
I will check this.
time.
We know very well that Marx changed the text of Capital Volume 1 exactly between 67 and 72. And the chapter on the commodity fetishism only appears first time in 72, not in 67. The other quote with the animal is from 67, where he still integrates the fetishism as part of the value form analysis as the last part. Only in 72 it's a chapter of its own. And this is really an interesting reference, and too bad that Samo is not here, because partly this is actually Samo's argument about the ideal capitalist subject. It would be a sadomasochistic subject. So the ideal one would be a masochistic, but still has too much power, of course, in this perverse manipulation of the sadist. So I think, yeah, this was probably, that is a strong argument for Samo's book, actually. But let me use your question for a different answer. I know it's not correct, but I skipped the whole part where I extracted from Samu's book the parallel reading of signification in language and signification in value. The weakest point of this whole parallel reading, sorry, I should say homology, not parallel, not analogy, it's homology, is what is meaning? Is meaning, in terms of the commodity, depending on perspective, is meaning the value, or is meaning the use value? And this is really a problem because this is exactly in Benjamin. It is the morning that the use value has no meaning anymore. And the realm of meaning is now dealt with by the exchange value. This is the meaning of a thing. Whereas in the parallel reading or the homology reading of both, of linguistic value and economic value, meaning is definitely on the side of the use value dimension, because the linguistic value has no meaning. It is just a linguistic value. It only its Bedeutung, its meaning, when one object, sensuous object, is attached to a signifier. So that's basically also the problem in this paper. That was, while reading it, occurred to me that I used meaning in two different ways, depending on perspective. Whether either you could look from the position of exchange value or from the position of use value. And probably these are the two irreconcilable perspectives at stake in this slightly Hegelian reading with which I started, and the Benjaminian reading as allegory in the last part. But sorry that that just became clear to me. But it's a great allusion. I mean, this is something maybe that should be explored. Probably Marx read it.
No, hopefully. I just have a question for Keti, because I was wondering, would you agree with the following, that there's a problematic reading of the end of art, the infinite end of art? And I mean, the main proponent, very famous proponent, would...
I don't hear.
Oh, well, I hear a lot of noise.
It has echoing.
I'm not sure what to do, but can you hear me when I mean...
a little bit distance.
Okay,
yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering, the critical part on post-conceptual arts, which began to be critical in conceptual art. I was wondering, I mean, it sounded, you basically said, if I understood the argument, it is as if it's a reification. It's a crap reading of Hegel. It's a reification of the very move of ending art. And if I understood, and it's more a question of comprehension, if I understood you correctly, you basically said what Danto, he would be one of the main culprits, declared to be the end of art, right? An art which you basically can understand with a complete subtraction of sensuous matter, right? I mean, if someone tells you, I have a wonderful conceptual idea for an artwork, you don't need to see the artwork if you get the idea. That was Danto, right? And he basically argued this is the transition from art into philosophy within art, right? And if I understood your argument correctly, what then happened, the next step is, even these concepts are emptied out, right? And that would be the move to conceptual art. So it's not only sensuous matter it gets lost, but they don't even have a fucking idea, to put it differently, right? And what then happens, that would be the point. Then the sensuous material, in its most stupid way, power struggles and so forth, returns. But that would be an end of art, which is a regression to objective spirit, to a stupid version of objective spirit. That would be, right? I mean, it's not superseded by religion afterwards, but just like regression, pure and simple decay. in a sense.
Yes,
right?
but what was my final argument, that this decay in terms of this profane ending of art, not conceptual ending of art, which is never ending, because the end of art is asserting art in terms of comprising this end as some kind of paradigm of arts being the end. But there is this, you know, absolutely non-articulated whatever, which we have nowadays. It's because when the end of art is conceptualized, you are deploring this end. And I mean, a huge amount of thinkers are just serving and assisting this end and making this procedure of mourning of this end. And actually, this is what is contemporary art and modernist art. Whereas if we come to absolute looseness of some kind of elemental and nominalist presences, then the question of end is not even arising. So it's like there is no death. There is death, but it's not articulated as death. But my final argument was, despite of this nominalization, there is some kind of automatic procedure which is squeezing it back into conceptualization to survive as this abstraction, which is the form of capital, the form of capital's idealism.
So,
I have actually three very synthetic questions. The first, what do you mean exactly by saying that Adorno's aesthetic is somehow anti-aesthetic, first? Second, what do you really, I mean, can you make a definition of this art institution that you've been quoting all over your presentation? Because it's not clear, especially if you put in the same, in the parallel, as a sort of response to it, bringing together Malevich and Kossuth. And in that sense, I'd like to understand, how do you understand or see their similarities? Thank you. How there you can bring Kossuth and Malevich in the same understanding of this art institution? I don't get that.
do you see any
Because
similarities between Malevich and Kossuth?
not that you see, no. How it was linked to the art institute, and I really don't understand. Can you basically just define what art institution is that you've been criticizing? That wasn't clear. Thanks.
Well, of course, if you take a separate art institution which is functioning as a concrete social agency and governmental or non-governmental, municipal or non-municipal enterprise, I didn't mean that. I meant the act of instituting something in its authority to claim some inexistent property of this work, because when Duchamp is putting the pissoir into museum, he's inventing certain. Not only a piece of art, but the way generally the impossibility of aesthetics will operate. And the reason why Adorno is not aesthetics, it's of course a provocation, but it's interesting to think that it's not aesthetics, because actually Hegel is starting his aesthetics by the fact that I have no other word. I wouldn't call it aesthetics, and I wouldn't agree with Kantian aesthetics. Aesthetics is the question of perception. Aesthetics is the issue of judgment, and ideation. Idea and why, for instance, Badiou is juxtaposing in aesthetics and aesthetics is again the necessity to bring forth the spirit. And for Adorno, what is important is exactly this issue, the idea, the spirit, and he defies Kantian aesthetics completely. He defies the issue of taste, he defies the issue of judgment, and he claims art as the alterity of production, alterity of extreme production, this extremity to all around. And in capitalist condition, this extremity even extrapolates and becomes stronger. That's why it is aesthetics as far as there is no other word, but it's some kind of supra-aesthetics. Well, as for the Institute, it's also a provocation, but it's very useful to think in this direction because, I mean, look at what artists were doing all the time and what was Adornian condition to produce such work of art, one work of art which totally undermines, defies, and makes collapse the whole history of art. So such type of revolutionizing that is like casting away the whole history.
I mean, and like a paradigm, it's an opposition to the paradigm of art itself, not an art institution that is defining it. Because you've used Malevich and Kossuth as examples, not Duchamp. That's why I'm asking that. Because the institution, yes, frame, has a completely different shape. You know, it shapes it differently. So I'm just trying to understand if I missed something in that point.
Yeah, but again, I would mention two directions. There is direction to treat Duchamp as Didier Berman does, and as Greenberg and his disciple. I mentioned this woman. Krauss, Rosalind Krauss does, and there is how avant-garde theories deal with the same issues of radical instituting. So this is different. Rosalind Krauss always sees the aesthetical issue, even with the conceptual issue. Well, it's a big discussion, and I have a text on it, on this disjunction between aestheticizing the conceptual act and radically de-aestheticizing it. So it's not that I assert something and I would contradict you, but I would like to think in both directions.
Anybody? We still have time. Tired? Okay.
It's also for Keti, but it's really just understanding, like I'm trying to understand the ending of your talk when you mentioned the image of descending and then ascending, and then you even mentioned Christ. So I was just wondering if I got you correctly. I know, of course, that once you mentioned Hegel, you have also mentioned Christianity in a way. It's hard to separate them, but still, I would wonder, I mean, maybe, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but are you describing contemporary art or art in general?
No. Well, in this figure, I was, when I brought the example of socialist aesthetics, I was making a complete rupture with what I said previously, because this was the condition of communist aesthetics, which is believing in sensuousness. It is not defying sensuousness. So if you go to communist philosophy, it will be saying that abstraction is part and parcel of capitalist economy and of libidinal economy. Therefore, as soon as you deprive the society of private property, then you have the chance of comprising matter and idea. That's why, well, Christ is the symbol and Hegelian symbol of this, of incarnation of spirit, which is possible when the alienation is sublated. Of course, it's a paradisiacal, utopian ideal situation, but this was the issue of communism, right? Wacky.
Yeah, my question is also related to the problem of descending, ascending, and Christ, and all these kind of things. how would you relate to Auerbach's concept of figura? I mean, would it make sense for you to think about this kind of manifestation of the idea in the sensorial through what Auerbach developed regarding the figura in the Mimesis book? But I think there's also a shorter text.
Baumgarten's. What did
No, Auerbach, Erich Auerbach.
Auerbach's. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, if there's no more questions for today, I would thank you all for participation on this, I would say, very successful day. I'm obliged to say that. And I will repeat it, that I think it was a very successful day. So tomorrow we will proceed with our schedule. At 10 a.m. there's obligatory coffee. And at 11 there's end of course lecture. So you are all invited there. Thank you for now. Okay.